I had the opportunity to chat, some months ago with Marcus about his burgeoning research interest in economic policy in Australia in the latter part of the Second World War and subsequent to the Second World War. And it's a very fascinating conversation. Marcus himself, I should say, Dr. Marcus Champ is a long time advocate for, enthusiastic and well-informed advocate for modern monetary theory, with whom I was familiar many years before we started this master's degree program. And it is a great pleasure to invite Marcus to address us on his topic, which is Reframing the State, Wartime Experience and Lessons for the Coming Climate Catastrophe. So over to Marcus.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Gabby, as always. And thanks to everyone who's turned up today for what I hope will be an interesting discussion. So, as Stephen said, what I'm talking about today is I'm very interested in the period over World War II where all the main combatants, of course, had to cope with a devastating worldwide conflict. Obviously, some of those were those that started it, but the point being that from an economic viewpoint, they all had to adjust to it and make considerable changes to their economy around that. And what we can take from that experience going forward, I'm sure everyone here is well aware that under the current economic ideology or methodology, the government and the state is considered to be subservient to the market and market forces. And yet, during a very critical period, the absolute opposite was reality. So we'll go through a little around that and talk about some of the extent of the changes that were made during that period and the responses that various societies had. So, as a quick introduction, World War II in a nutshell, and obviously this is going to be pretty high level, and I'm more than happy to go into detail on every little incident in World War II at another time. This is not that time. So, World War II, what was some of its characteristics? Well, it was a catastrophic global conflict in terms of its scope, its impact, the casualties, in every sense of the word. It was the most defining event of the last, easily 100 years, if not longer. In many ways, World War II was a directly caused or an extension of World War I, but it was also a very different conflict as well. The war at the end of the day was, as many of these conflicts are, but World War II absolutely had this, a war of competing ideology and, importantly, economic systems. Interestingly, during the conflict, and look, I have to say I'm not unhappy about this, the Axis countries underperformed economically during the war period, whereas it can be easily argued that the Allies overperformed. And in particular, Russia or USSR at that time and the USA were underpinned and were the foundation upon which the victory over the Axis was built, as you'll see. The conflict also spanned an incredible period of technical innovation. From the start of the conflict was essentially still in biplanes, and yet by the end of the conflict, we're moving to jets. Modern medicine didn't exist essentially before World War II. Ushered in the computing age and the space race and the atomic age at the end of the day. So an incredible period of technical and technological advancement. The Western Allies, in particular, had a very deliberate strategy, which they were not keen to repeat World War I. And so they had a very deliberate strategy of steel, not flesh. And by that, I mean they were more than happy to throw resources and machines and equipment at a problem not keen to take casualties. There were some exceptions, but on the Western Ally side, this was absolutely a deliberate strategy. The Allies, at the end of the day, had superior cooperation. Their alliance system was unprecedented almost in history. Their economic system was superior, their war strategy was superior, and the governments of the Western nations were able to harness their resources more effectively. And a very key theme throughout this discussion will be around resources. And at the end of the day, this is, I think, a critical lesson that we can take going forward from addressing the climate catastrophe that is coming. So I'm going to do a very brief introduction to war economics, and this is taken from a book at the time, 1942, Introduction to War Economics. And I'm just doing this very briefly, again, to provide a foundational piece of along which everything else we're going to discuss needs to be viewed through this lens. War economics is concerned with the allocation of resources of a nation to achieve victory over its enemies. An abundance of specific types of resources of goods rather than abundance of money is the prime requisite for war making. So just to labor the point, wars are won by goods, not money. How to pay for the war was essentially determined with that end in view. So if there was, I am, of course, part of this whole piece is to understand what was actually going on in the decision-making rooms of the Western Alliance in particular, but Australia is going to be a particular area of focus. And even in this early stage, any time that the issue of money comes up, it sort of goes back to we need the resources. The resources are more important. It's around how do we resource this conflict, not how do we pay for it, which segues very nicely and sits within a modern monetary framework. And at the end of the day, from an ecological economics framework, it's all about the resources, baby. And they were absolutely critically aware of that. Everything they did revolved around that. So hold that thought. So just very briefly, when it does come to how the war was resourced and financed, there were a couple of key principles involved. And again, you'll see these coming up repeatedly, especially when we get into a bit of discussion on specific policies and actions that were undertaken. Increased production, a bit of a no-brainer. Decrease personal consumption. At the end of the day, it wasn't just about producing more, it was reducing the amount that was consumed to release resources and financing. And at the end of the day, most importantly, and resourcing has to be also shown through this lens, it's not just steel, not just tanks, weapons, planes, it's manpower. Manpower at the end of the day was actually the driving factor for all of the combatants, particularly Germany for a whole variety of very good reasons. It was also, so not just about decreasing personal consumption and reallocation of resources or manpower, but reduce investment in, so essentially any new forms of capital, any new building, if it wasn't related to a war effort, was essentially just stopped. The markets in many ways were put on pause is one way to put it, or essentially put on hold. Markets as we know them today didn't exist in many ways during that period, and it was just done. Like there was no debate. There was, I mean, sure, there was some legislation that was passed, absolutely. And I guess another key feature of this is a sort of a lens to apply to this is this was when you have a clear and present danger, this is what can be achieved. And I think part of the challenge that we have around the climate issue is that so far there hasn't, I mean, the burning platform is there, but I don't think people are feeling it, which is part of the reason we're having some challenges. But anyway, hopefully wouldn't need to go to this extent to do actions, but anyway. And of course, not just reduce investment in new forms of capital, but depleting existing capital. So maintenance on infrastructure, on buildings, was all just stopped. It was all, if it wasn't related to the war effort, it was essentially stopped or greatly curtailed or shifted. So that's sort of like those high-level points around the approach that was taken. I'll first off get into some detail now of because many people here probably don't realize the extent to which the economic transformation occurred over that period. So I'm going to provide a very quick overview of World War II from an economic perspective in like 4 slides. This is a very quick view of GDP change in the main combatants over the World War II period. There should be some pretty obvious trends there. The US obviously is an absolute standout throughout that period. And you have to keep in mind that this growth occurred essentially over a 6-year period. For Germany and certainly the USSR and the UK, there was growth, but it was very up and down. And look, with the USSR, there's an obvious reason for that. They were invaded by the Axis powers, and at one point, almost 40% of their total sum production was behind enemy lines or destroyed. And their story is quite remarkable. I won't be going into much of their story today for a variety of reasons, but I just want to acknowledge that their contribution to the war effort was absolutely critical. There's just not just from a point of view of the casualties they took, but from the economic viewpoint was a miracle in its own way. But I will be focusing just for today to highlight some key stories on the US and Australia. But I just want to acknowledge that. Just going along with that, to the right, I've just posted a slide that looks at how did GDP change for the major powers from 1938 to 1945. And there's a pretty stark story there of one side have massive increase and the other side essentially a decrease. It's not just because of obviously the campaign, very deliberate campaign to destroy the industrial capacity of the Axis powers undertaken by the Allies. But that was part of the story and a very successful part of that story, but it was more fundamental than that in terms of their economic system, which I won't be able to get into that much detail today because it's on the Axis side, as I said. But I just want to acknowledge that this in a nutshell is the story of World War II. In terms of the economic story itself, this here is a very quick overview of where the number of armed forces in the Axis and Allied powers were before in 1939. Very clear picture there. One side was, pretty much more prepared for this conflict than another. And in fact, at this point in time, you'd be hard pressed to say that, it'd be easy to call out that the one side was likely to win. And yet the opposite occurred. Same story, 1945, and you can see the difference that has occurred over that period and the massive growth in various powers, particularly the USSR and the USA, but United Kingdom as well, and more modest growth and completely knocking out, of course, Italy by this stage of the war was already defeated on the Axis side. And really the story of World War II from an economics perspective is a story of US and USSR and the miracle of economics that they perpetuated over that period. So very quickly, we'll go into some of the main production over that period. So in terms of aircraft production, with the Allies on the left, Axis on the right, and very clear trend can be seen there with the US in particular. Actually, at one point, FDR set a target for US industry of 50,000 aircraft in 1 year. And the German leaders just thought that was pure propaganda. No one could possibly achieve that. And as it turned out, they almost did. So as I said, the turnaround in the US economy was remarkable in particular. Going to tank and assault gun production. And although the Germans are renowned for their blitzkrieg and their tank armies, they were a minnow, frankly, compared to the US and the USSR in particular. And you can quite clearly see the production story that's going on there between the Allied powers and the Axis powers. In terms of naval production, it's actually pretty hard to get anyone else on the chart after you take into account the US ship naval production over the World War II period. The US had a international, and this is part of their challenge, is at the end of the day, they had an ocean on either side of them between them and their those that they were combating. So they had to build as well a world dominating navy on top of an air force, on top of the ground armies as well. So, and it should be pointed out, I'll make a point later, that in the production of the US in 1938, their armies were amongst the smallest in the world. And their production, for instance, in tanks in 1938 was 15. I am not making that up, or around about that anyway. Okay. There are, again, to highlight what was done over that period, there were I'm going to focus on 3 main production facilities in World War II in the US, again, just to highlight what was achieved during that period. First one, I don't know if anyone's heard of Willow Run. It was literally a field, a brown field at that, in 1939 when it was designed. It was designed to build B-24 heavy bombers, was the main production of that facility. This is what it looked like when it was completed, only about 12 months after the foundations were laid. It was the largest production facility of its kind in the world. In fact, it's still, if it was still around today, it would be one of the largest production facilities on Earth. And what that factory did, if you look on the inside, this is what it looked like. So this is the production run of B-24 bombers. This particular, so Willow Run had 42,000 workers at its height, built 9,000 aircraft. At its height, it was putting out 1 bomber in every hour. So hour after hour, it was churning out a B-24 bomber. This one factory produced more aircraft than Japan, to give you a bit of a comparison. Overall, the US built approximately close to 300,000 aircraft over World War II. So that's Willow Run. Next one, we'll have a quick look at the Chrysler tank arsenal. So this was a purpose-built. Again, it did not exist prior to 1940. It was built near Detroit, commissioned August 1940, production started 1941. It was building tanks, in particular, Sherman tanks. This facility built around 22,000 tanks over the 1941 to 1945 period, including 18,000 Sherman tanks. To give you an idea, there were about 50,000 Sherman tanks were built overall over the World War II period. This one factory built as many tanks as Germany, essentially. Not quite, but it's getting close anyway. And you can see the mass production techniques that were utilized very clearly. Last one, and this is probably the most mind-blowing of all. People have probably heard about the Liberty ship. So the Liberty ship was essentially a standard transport ship that was designed in the US and was put into mass production. So on the left here, this is just one. There were 18 shipyards built to build these ships. You can see even in this picture, there's roughly 12 or so Liberty ships under construction at the same time. You can actually see in the middle of the picture there, you sort of see a bit of a crowd and a ship being launched in that picture. There were 2,700 of these ships built over the World War II period. On average, there were 3 ships, or the 3 Liberty ships were built every 2 days. On the right, this is a particularly famous version. This is the Robert E. Peary. This particular vessel, there was a competition to see how fast. I'm hoping you're seeing these slides. Anyone's saying that they're not getting them?
Yeah, we can see them.
Okay, brilliant.
I can.
That's very good. So the Robert E. Peary, so there's a competition as how fast they could build one of these. And so various shipyards sort of competed with each other, so how fast they could build them. The Robert E. Peary was laid down and it was built in 4 days, 15 hours. And in fact, 7 days after its keel had been laid, it was already filled with cargo and on its way to its new destination. 7 days. And that's a 10,000-ton cargo vessel. These ships were literally built faster than the Germans could sink them. So hopefully that just gives you a very high-level introduction as to the sort of economic transformation that was undertaken through this period. Just going to pivot now to a little bit more local and an Australian war industry. So Australia still has a bit of a reputation as didn't really contribute that much to World War II in many ways. So I guess another way to put it is that the US just overwhelmed everyone. But actually Australia, contributed way above its weight in many different categories. And on the left is just a few pictures that, although it's very difficult to believe now, that Australia built all its own ammunition. It, at one point, actually almost built its own tank, literally from scratch in 12 months. The only reason it wasn't progressed is because by the time the tank was ready to go, the Sherman tank was now being produced in numbers, and it was decided collectively that it was probably just better to continue on with the Sherman tank. But the point being is that, and by the way, the Australian tank was designed here, it was built here, it was used techniques that were very ahead of its time. At one point, it was literally the most powerful Allied tank that was designed at that period. Australia also had its own aircraft industry. It produced a number of different aircraft, from fighters to fighter bombers. There was even indeed, and I didn't even know this at the time, it had its own version essentially of the Mustang, which if it had gone into production, it would have been more powerful, faster, more maneuverable than the US Mustang. But again, it was sort of by that time, US aircraft production was to such an extent, it wasn't deemed to be most efficient to continue that production line. Also, the Australians built their own small weapons, and at the top there is a very famous, the Owen submachine gun, which was hands down the best submachine gun of World War II. So, Australian war industry, I'll just make a couple of key points. Australia supplied more food per head of population to the Allied war effort of any other country. In fact, at one point, the Australian economy was feeding 5 million extra people. Just to put that in perspective, the Australian population at the time was about 7 million. So it was feeding almost double the amount of population than what it had at that point in time. Australia and New Zealand supplied the majority of the clothing, ammunition, medical support, and basic supplies for all the Allied forces in the Pacific. So MacArthur's forces were fed by Australian factories. Their ammunition was supplied by Australian factories. Their medicine and their medical facilities were largely provided by medical personnel and support from Australia. Not that he ever mentioned that, but that is reality. Even by August 1942, the Australians already had roughly 656,000 in the armed forces, with a further workforce of 50,000 that had been created specifically for defence construction. Approximately 20% of the entire male population was already mobilised and in either armed forces or defence production by August 1942. So Australia absolutely transformed its economy just as much, if not more so, from a per capita perspective than the US or certainly the UK, as in terms of the other allied nations, and made a very significant contribution to the war effort. So what I'm going to pivot to now, as much as I could talk hours and hours and hours on this sort of stuff, it's probably more pertinent around what was some of the economic actions and activities that the Australian government undertook over that period. So just talking, let's focus on manpower first. There was a works council that was established to build defence facilities, airfields, docks, roads, barracks, hospitals, etc. That 50,000 workforce, and a very substantial infrastructure program was initiated. there was a Manpower directorate created, and all men and women of working age were essentially registered with this directorate. Essential industries that were protected, and for those protected industries, you could not volunteer, you couldn't leave, you couldn't be dismissed. Absenteeism was severely restricted. I mean, they would take people off the shop floor, obviously, if they were very ill, but there was no sickies during the World War II period. There was a lot of conflict with unions because essentially strikes were more or less outlawed. I mean, there were industrial issues throughout the war period, but also interestingly, unprotected industries. So if you were not deemed to be essential to the war effort, you couldn't recruit, you could not replace, you were not allowed essentially at best, you stayed still, or in fact, in many industries, they were essentially shut down. And we'll get to that a little bit further down the track. In terms of, this is a very interesting one. Equal rights wasn't quite a feature around about this period. So there was a deal done between the government and the unions where women were allowed to go into occupations previously reserved for men, as long as there was an assurance that after the war, all those women would leave. So, maybe a little bit of development there in terms of equal opportunity yet to be progressed. But I found that an interesting tidbit around the whole approach as well. So moving on to some of the industry policies that were progressed. And by the way, the pictures you're seeing on the slides, these are posters taken from examples at the time. And you can see very clearly, right? So there were key messaging around only buy what you need to reduce that consumption. There was a whole range of policies put in place, but there was a lot of programs and efforts made to reduce consumption, to reuse and recycle materials, don't waste materials. This was all part of the program of work that was undertaken to reduce consumption at the domestic economy and to release resources for the war economy. All building activity, if it wasn't related to the war effort, was essentially stopped or at least severely curtailed. Public holidays were cancelled. I found this one funny. Even race meetings were in fact banned. Interstate travel required permits, although I did note that pubs were kept open for. I found a reference that it was deemed a morale issue, and the Prime Minister signed off that pubs were allowed to stay open. All production in all sectors, whether it was within war, if it was in a war period, a war industry, so standardization and concentration of production, including for agriculture. If it was a non-war industry, standardization of production was brought in so one was to best use resources most efficiently. The other one, at the end of the day, was designed to release resources. Packaging was reduced, advertising discouraged. It was interesting as well. At one point, they even banned any deliveries beyond 1 mile from local stores was stopped or restricted. Obviously to reduce things like petrol obviously was one of the critical resources. It was Curtin that signed off on the pubs, just for interest sake, by the way. Anyway, so they were all wanted to reduce the use of petrol, being an obvious critical resource. So things like deliveries were curtailed, and once again, it was about releasing resources from the private sector and reducing consumption and directing those resources into the war industry. And as I said, there was a massive infrastructure and defense building program that was implemented. In terms of standardization of production, there's even some interesting stories around that. So there were even, to give you an extent of the attention that was provided and the regulations that were brought in, there were government designs that were approved for things like pajamas, and shirts were only could only be a certain length. Pajamas, a very simple design. There was even a victory suit was designed by the government, and this victory suit prohibited waistcoats. It reduced the number of buttons. It only had the trousers were, in terms of the amount of material that could be used for the suit. And keep in mind, this was at that period, a suit was like a standard clothing that every guy would have, right? So the extent to which they were controlling the production went where they literally said to the clothing companies, of which those that could still retain open for domestic production, they literally handed them the design and said, you do this. If you move outside of that, you will be closed down. So it just gives you an idea of the extent to which control was applied across the economy. In terms of the banking, finance, and insurance sector, many of these will resonate happily, I suspect, with many of the people here. Interest rates were fixed by Treasury because at that time, the central bank was a Department of Treasury. And when it came to the interest rates, they said, we'll make the interest rates X, and the interest rates were made X. Off the top of my head, I think they was fixed at about 2.5% or 3% from memory. I need to follow that up further, but it was around about that amount. The main point being is the government directed interest rates to be fixed at a certain rate, and they were, because there was no, monetary policy and fiscal policy was in the same building, and it was all controlled by government. In many instances, and there are quite a few records around this, although taxation was absolutely increased in many ways over the war period, the central bank in numerous instances funded the balance between spending and taxation. This would come as no surprise to many of the MMT colleagues on this call, I suspect. Rationing, of course, was a key strategy around all this. Widespread price controls and wages and prices were pegged. So again, very considerable control across the economy in every industry. They even had whole investigations in the means of production and private sector companies had to justify their prices at every stage of production. And in some cases, the governments would either provide incentives or regulation to fix those prices or reduce those prices, and to control. Again, it was around controlling consumption, releasing resources, and at the end of the day, controlling inflation. If you were to summarize the World War II or approach to the economy over World War II, it would be resources and inflation, and they were two sides of the same coin. Profits, this is another interesting one. The government determined that there wasn't going to be any profit taking for war industry or government contracts, so they were fixed at 4% profit rate. You had to justify your costs and any sort of profits you had, and reports would be made back to the government on a regular basis, and you would be inspected by government administrators to ensure that that was what was going on. Of course, war bonds is a very big part of the whole process, and I've seen many instances where it was very clear the war bonds were implemented primarily to drain funds from the private sector. If people didn't have money in their accounts, they couldn't spend it. And obviously with war industry, employment was essentially 100% between the war industry and or armed forces. Wages were going up. It was a very lucrative time to be a worker during this period. You didn't have many products in the stores. You couldn't spend it. So people were building up substantial savings. Those savings had to be drained or controlled in order for them not to be spent where the government didn't want them to be spent. And war bonds were a very critical strategy to do exactly this. On a side note, it's also worth keeping in mind, this wasn't just an Australian phenomenon. The UK government and the US government did exactly the same thing, and they were also very clear. War bonds were not there to fund the war effort. They were there primarily to drain funds from the private sector, so they would not be available to spend on on potentially inflationary spending or take resources away from the war effort. Banks were very strictly controlled and restricted. Hundreds of branches were closed. The banks cried blue murder at the time, complained, carried on, and then obeyed. Trading in property and shares was severely curtailed, if not essentially stopped. So the stock market basically was put on hiatus for roughly 5 years and just essentially stopped. And this was again across the entire sector. There was some papers I found around that the government was essentially it's selecting which insurance companies would be allowed to continue and which ones weren't during the war period. And they were just shut, either closed down, shut, or just not operate, essentially put on pause during that period. War and inflation. Now, everything we've been talking about has been a war and inflation, but these are just some key ones to consider. Rationing, obviously, a very big piece of that. Consolidation of all income tax to the Commonwealth was during this period. Declaration. So this is where all prices, and they actually put ceilings on prices on various things, and cost of materials at all stages were regulated wherever possible. Strict controls and monitoring on all profit margins. Specific attention applied to key cost drivers. So prices on basic raw materials were fixed or subsidized. Production was redirected to essentials such as clothing, meat, vegetables, for sake of argument. In the domestic sector, anything that wasn't required was either shut down or curtailed or just stopped. The interesting one I found was they even fixed maximum prices, so that by fixing a maximum price, you effectively meant that luxury goods weren't able to be produced. So they didn't ban luxury goods, but they made sure that prices couldn't go above a certain level, which meant that luxury goods weren't economical or couldn't be produced because they were too expensive and were over that threshold for what the maximum price of a good would be. So it's just another, they pulled every lever that they possibly could, and multiple strategies going concurrently. Again, take away production and resources from the private sector, reduce spending and control inflation, and release resources to the war effort. And government assistance was granted for essential war needs so there would be grants or loans or just straight out grants made to build industry, to build up resources, to build the infrastructure and the capacity needed to provide the war effort. And standardization across all industries to remove costs. I hopefully by now, an almost repeatable mantra: reduce spending in the private sector, reduce resource use in the private sector, release those resources for the war effort. And as I said earlier, wages were pegged to price increases as another means. Now, there was inflation during the war period, right? There, obviously. However, compared, for instance, and I might add, this is another useful point, they took a lot of experience from the First World War and applied it to the Second World War, and they made a lot of mistakes in the First World War that they were very keen not to repeat. And the considering the massive transformation of the economy over this period, in things like inflation were, I mean, it still happened, and inflation did rise, but it was nowhere near what it was in the First World War or even after the war, because there were a lot of issues with their recovery period as well. And that brings us to another point. I haven't covered it today, but there was a very considerable effort to go, what do we do next? You know, what comes after the war? And again, taking those experiences from World War I, they were very keen not to repeat some of those mistakes. So there was a lot of planning, even as the war progressed, and especially by 1944 and 45, when victory was all but assured, it was switching to what comes next. Anyway, so some of the observations I think we can take from this war experience, or this high-level view of the war experience so far. The power of the state and institutions was flexed over this crisis period. The war provided experience of government versus market and the social and governmental relationships and institutions that make markets work. enormous growth of government at the expense of the private sector, and resource displacement of market by government allocation. No market or government intervention could solve deficiency of real resources. It was very clear. You could throw as much money as you wanted to a problem. If the real resources weren't available, then you had to find something else alternative or go without. They were acutely conscious. It was all about the resources. War financing focused on control of the money supply and the private sector purchasing power, not funding the war effort, not paying for things, but essentially to curtail and control the private sector. Economies were violently and utterly transformed over the war period. Societies as well placed enormous trust in their governments during the crisis for what was obviously a very clear and present danger. But this did have its limits, and there was quite a lot of unrest and issues that came up, from the activities that were going on, and constant government communication about what they were doing, why they were doing it, and the activities that they were doing was a big feature throughout this whole period. They didn't just let people in a vacuum, essentially, make up their own minds. They had a very deliberate strategy of, yes, obviously propaganda was part of it, but a lot of it was also just educating people to say, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is what it's for, to help to build the social license to do this. And to me, actually, in terms of what some of the key lessons are, albeit at this early stage, I would say it's that you need to bring your population along with you for the journey. If people don't understand why you're doing something or what it is you're doing, and what the end goals are, you're going to have a very difficult time to get the social license to make these sorts of transformative changes that you want to make. And they were very, very acutely conscious of this throughout that war period. So they just got some references, but that's basically covers what I want to cover, and happy to take any questions.
Fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Marcus. Super interesting. There's been a bit of a discussion in the chat too.
So I didn't cover World War I in much detail other than to make a couple of high-level points. So the Versailles Treaty and that sort of issues for World War I, obviously that was a big, I won't say cause is one way. Well, it certainly had a cause in terms of World War II, and there were lots of lessons they took from that period. But it was more so that the World War, especially the post-World War I period, was in many ways lessons for what not to do for a future peace. As it turned out, it wasn't an issue. And this is another feature of World War II I didn't really touch on, is that World War II is very different in that the main combatants, or I should say those that started the war, they didn't actually give up. They were literally conquered. Now, that is actually unusual in world warfare for the last 500 years or so. Typically, there used to be you defeat the armies in the field and the other side would give up. That didn't happen. So World War II was a very definite. It was very clear who had won and who had lost. There was no debate. So from that respect, some of the things that happened after World War II weren't relevant to something happened after World War I weren't relevant to World War II, but at the same token, also the post-war period was very different for different reasons, and I could go into that at length, but we'll probably leave that for another time.
Thanks. Do you want to unshare your slides so we can see people for the Q&A?
Sure.
There we go. Fantastic. I'm sure there's a few questions, but I wanted to ask about social license, and I know you're a psychologist as well,
yeah.
Marcus, and what are your thoughts on whether that sort of collective, working towards a singular aim with obviously not every single member of the population, but the majority sort of having a mutual understanding of what the facts are, what the reasons are, what the mission is. How likely are we to be able to recreate something like that, or are we just too divided now?
Sure. Look, it should be pointed out, by the way, that if there's like the interwar period was a very divisive period in Europe, in the US, and here in Australia. You had the rise of communism, you had politics. I mean, politics is bad now. It is arguable that interwar period, especially in the US, was way worse, if you could believe it. A very difficult period. Look, I think one of the advantages, if you could call it that, is you had at the end of the day a very clear and present danger. Like, I mean, the Nazi regime was pretty horrendous, and there were, and this is another feature, there were bent over. No one wanted a war in 1939. Well, even the Germans didn't want it, but they at least planned for it, and where they had expected that the war would be in mid 40s. That's what their war plan was. It ended up being earlier. But why? Part of the reason, because Hitler broke every agreement he ever made. So when it came to Poland, of course, there was a whole lead up to that, but that period where it was often, the peace in our time and, the 1938 and so on, people were cheering at that period. People, Chamberlain was viewed as a hero because he had perceived to have prevented a war, and no one wanted a war. Well, certainly not in the Western Europe in that period. But, Hitler, being who he was, pushed it further. And he was convinced that no one would go to war over Poland. That was he bet that. He was convinced they were just going to cave again. And it didn't. And that brought on everything. So it was a very clear and present danger, which absolutely has to be recognized as a key feature of this period. And I guess that's going to be part of the challenge going forward, and why it's been so easy in many ways to undermine the climate issue is it's not the same, right? I mean, yes, obviously things are happening and we can all see it, but it's also very easy to say, yeah, it looks fine. Weather's fine. It's just weather. I think in some ways, sadly, it's going to take a major incident or issue to happen that sort of wakes people up and goes, these things have to change. And I'll be the first to say, World War II period, it was very clear, right? It was, you could tell. And look, I might add as well, it is also needs to be understood in 1940 or even up to 41, if you're a betting person, you would have thought the Axis would win. Like, it was pretty dire in those early war years. And no one would have thought that the end result was going to be what it was. So, yeah, that is a major issue, and that's one thing that period had, was there was no question that it was an existential threat, no question. But having said that, that communication piece was critical. And by the way, and I see that someone did post a question, there was a lot of pushback on a lot of these policies. The private sector and big business in particular screamed blue murder almost every day, banging on, oh, this is communism. Oh, look at this. We're being taken over. You're right. I mean, and it shouldn't become as no surprise, by the way, for those who are familiar with it, that it was about this period that the funding of a pushback process was started with various billionaires and so on, particularly in the US, to undermine the whole process. And FDR, and again, FDR, I mean, the whole reason the US didn't go into the war at first is because the vast majority of the people were against it. And the political opposition that he had, really, in many ways, it was Pearl Harbor that broke the back of that opposition. But Yeah, that's another whole story. But there was a lot of pushback is the main point. And they were very conscious of that. And they went out of their way to explain it was always, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and this is the end result.
Thank you. James has a question.
Yeah, absolutely excellent, Marcus. That was really comprehensive and great. It occurred to me from one of your earlier slides where you were saying the Axis underperformed and
Yep.
the Allies are overperformed, that one of the key differences that you kind of you really covered was that the Allies had this comprehensive economic plan, and that was to utilize underutilized resources, humans and labor and whatever was available. Whereas the Axis were, they acquired their resources by conquest, forced labor, and then degraded their own resources through
that is correct.
The murder of those populations. So
happy to talk a little bit more about that if you're interested.
I'd love to hear more.
Okay, brilliant. So yeah, so why did the Axis underperform? Well, there was a number of different reasons. So at one point, Germany essentially owned Europe, and the productive capacity that was under the control of the Axis forces was way beyond the Allies at one point. However, they didn't turn that potential capacity into actual production. Why? Well, one of them was, as you said, they conquered. And it wasn't just that they conquered. So the standard German response was when they took over another country, they stripped it. They stripped the factory. So what they did was that, so this is sort of from an ecological economics viewpoint, anyone who's been doing that recently, you've had this sort of stock of capital and the flow of capital. So they destroyed the stock of capital. So yes, they would intern populations. They would, let's just keep it quite blunt, kill them. They would starve them. They stripped the factories and they literally, they pillaged, they looted everything that they could get their hands on. And that's fine in a short term, that gives you a bit of a sugar hit. But in the terms of a longer term, it undermined their whole economy. And slave labor, well, slaves are all well and fine, but they're not as productive as someone who's working for something they believe in. And it's interesting actually, because German war production actually didn't kick in until it was only until 1942 that all of a sudden they pushed the panic button and said, oh my God, we're in trouble. Like 1942, the production in England even was above Germany well before that. And part of it was complacency. Part of it was, like I said, the looting, and part of it at the end of the day, because you're talking about a horrendous regime. They treated anyone else but them as inferior and discarded them. And in fact, you could make a very strong argument. The entire war was started essentially to bolster food production for Germany. And the way they deliberately going to the east. So they saw Ukraine as the breadbasket of future Germany, and their plan was literally to depopulate in every sense of the word and bring German colonists to empty land to build the Lebensraum. That was their new empire. That was the plan. So they had a deliberate strategy of destruction of the capital stock, and it didn't work out for them. What a surprise. Oh, yes, and that's another good point. The fascist regime was dysfunctional. I mean, there's no other word for it. And Hitler, he was the top of the pile, and he was not very good. I mean, he didn't have a strategy, didn't know what he was doing, didn't understand industry, didn't understand a lot, really, except how to murder people. He was very good at that.
And yet it seemed to be quite successful in the 1930s before the war.
Well, yes, but it's very easy before the war and this is part of the history, right? So Germany was a economic basket case in the early 30s. Like the depression hit everyone hard. Germany was arguably the worst hit, and they had the Weimar Republic and so there were a lot of factors there. and let's keep in mind, what did he promise at the start? Jobs for everyone. I mean, that's where it started. They didn't necessarily know or expect that those jobs were going to be in the armed forces and it was going to be to conquer everyone else. That they didn't lead with that, right? That came after a very long line of moving people from where they were to where they needed them to be in a very deliberate propaganda effort. And I could talk around that for a long period of time. But anyway, at the end of the day, it was a horrendous regime, and they didn't understand. They planned for this to be a quick war. It was meant to be over quickly, and then be done, and everyone was going to give up and make peace. That was their war plan. Unfortunately, they had a horrendous regime that already proved they couldn't be trusted. And then when the chips laid down, they were shocked. Oh, why isn't everyone believing us? Well, why do you think? Anyway.
There's a question from Tom in the chat. With bonds, were they sold as a permanent solution or delayed, meaning postponement of the worker?
No, it was always, and this is part of what they were trying to do, is say, look, we know you're going to have difficulty now, and we know you're going to have, it's going to be hard. There's going to be sacrifices, but just hold on, right? It's not, and that, so even on that very second slide, one of the points there was that it was steel, not flesh, and it was, and in the war economics, one of the points they made there was defeat your opponent quickly, because they knew that you could only press people so long, and especially like in the US by 1945, the public were over it, even though that they by no means had. They were the best off. They didn't have anywhere near the sacrifices of anyone else, but there was a very strong, and it wasn't just the US, to be fair, right? It was a very strong public had shifted to go, we've had enough. Can we just get this thing over? And by the way, that is one, like, in terms of the atomic bombings, it needs to be understood in that period as to why that was an option. I mean, that's another whole different discussion. But it was one of those contextual factors that the war had to come to an end. They just couldn't go any longer. So it was always sold as a temporary measure, and when the war's over, everything go back to normal, and it would happen as quickly as they could. Stephen, I think you've got a question.
I was just going to say, what lessons from the 1940s influenced the next generation?
Well, that's an interesting question. I can't answer all of that now. I think, yeah, that's a very long one. I think though that there was a very big sense of community, especially in England, for example. The societies that went through the most pain, like Australia, England, Russia is another good example. That solidarity, I guess, and the sense of community that came from that suffering was a very big component of keeping up morale, of going through this together. And community was a very big, like, the cohesion of society. And I guess that's one thing the governments at the time and through that period were ultimately concerned about, was the society cohesion. And a lot of these policies were all around trying to keep things together. So after the war, and this is in the US as well, and Australia, US and UK, all by 1944, 45, were pivoting to what comes next. FDR in particular, like, I mean, I'm sure we've all seen his speech on the economic rights. Well, that was something he was planning to bring in after the war. Unfortunately, he passed away before that was able to happen, and it got diverted and curtailed. But both in the UK and Australia, there were very deliberate efforts as to what the post-construction period would be, and bring in a new welfare state, essentially, and like free healthcare, education, and all these sorts of things. And to some extent that got implemented, but there are other things that happened as well that made that more difficult. But there was an optimism for, let's not do that again. and let's do things differently. Now, obviously, that didn't all come to fruition, obviously, but that was certainly part of that post-war feeling. Is, for God's sake, we need to do things differently, and that whole, Bretton Woods and other sorts of things were part of that. Were they flawed? Yes. But it was all part of that feeling. And look, I mean, one thing it does need to be recognized is that US, almost like unlike any other conquering power in history, they left and then they funded Reconstruction. I mean, it was the Marshall Plan still should be considered one of the amazing achievements of the 20th century. Now, obviously, there are other reasons around that with the USSR and other sorts of things. Was a degree of self-interest? Yes. But what they did in Japan and Europe after the war was almost unprecedented in history.
Yeah, and I was thinking from Australia's perspective, there was essentially no unemployment in Australia from 1940 until 1975.
That is correct. Yeah, I mean, all of the major parties in Australia all came out with a full employment policy, for example. They all came, I mean, the massive public construction in housing after World War II, the 1950s with immigration and the building of infrastructure. This is all part of trying to build a different society that would be it was almost argued as, well, this is the legacy we have after we've gone through that terrible conflict. We want to make a better world. And look, to some extent, they succeeded. Unfortunately, it was also derailed, and we all know some of the reasons around that. Anyone else?
Well, Susan,
you're on mute, Susan.
Such a good talk, boy. Between you and James, I don't know. We're just setting a standard.
You're very kind, but anyway.
No, I mean it. I put my question in the chat, but I was thinking as you were going along, of course, that and Tom alluded to this later, is that in some ways we would like to mobilize some of the same kinds of resources on behalf of the other great things that are plaguing us now, not least of all the climate catastrophe that is near us. And I was, the way I put it was that in some ways the story you tell is a sort of very grand version of the Mazzucato mission economy tale.
Yes.
Except that it embraces everybody and everything, but it's still that kind of story. And I was asking, thinking about climate, I wondered if you had a view about how singular or focused the mission has to be in order to actually harness substantial portions of the economy.
So, I mean, from that World War II experience, I would say, again, there's that clear and present danger. And I think it does need to be targeted, right? And
Right.
I think to get the support for it, you have to be very clear as to what the outcomes you're going to have and bringing people along, right? I mean, as much as the government control by all the Western powers across World War II period was in many ways draconian, no doubt about it. But then who screamed the loudest, right? It was the richest that screamed the loudest, frankly.
Right.
While everyone else had a job, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the middle class was built essentially on World War II experience.
Right.
So, and it wasn't just they had a job, they had healthcare, they had a job, they had education, they had their basic needs were met. And that was a very big part of the whole thing. As much as people complained, oh, I can't get my extra meat today. Okay, fine. But are you hungry? No, right? And everyone was treated the same. And by the way, throughout this period, the maximum taxation rate on the richest people was 90%. And this was very high taxation rates in Australia as well, I might add, throughout this period. So, but it was that collective experience as well. So getting people to throw out their pots and that sort of thing. Okay, did it contribute much metal at the end of the day? No, but it made people feel that they were making a contribution, and it was a community thing, right? And it also made it very real and very tangible. It was very targeted. And this is again and again, they say, we're doing this for this reason, for that outcome. And they were very, very constant and clear on that. And of course, it was very easy when you had, like in Australia's case, the Japanese were only, you could almost see, where they were in New Guinea, and they were bombing Darwin on a regular basis at one point. Made very, very easy to see clear and present danger. So yeah, I think those sorts of things do need to be taken into account, and look, it was about building that trust. But why was it build that trust? Because it was they were honest and open about, and this is the other thing, they were open and honest about, this is going to hurt, but we're doing this for this reason. But who did it really hurt at the end of the day?
Right.
Who benefited the most? It was the average person benefited the most. I mean, other than
and also
from a casualty perspective.
Private enterprise going into the war came out pretty much intact at the end, right?
Oh, well, so the degree of control and partnership, we'll call it, between, say, the UK and Australia and US was quite different. The US did much more of a light touch and much more of a public-private partnership.
Yes.
But don't be fooled. The US was very clear, and big business was put in its place. And I think this is one lesson from the experience overall. Governments have the power to do this. For the last 50 years, what part of the whole economic framework has been, governments are subservient to markets. You can't do that because, you'll affect the markets. The markets will punish you. You're weak. You can't do that. Well, yes, you can. You just have to have the courage to do it. And having something like Nazi Germany on your doorstep, to be fair, was a fairly big motivator.
Right.
Yeah, I guess COVID gave us a small taste of, or a small kind of memory of that, which is, it seems like such a long time ago. It was only 5 years ago, and but it is in living memory now for people who are voting, and yeah.
And just one other point, I just want to reiterate this again. I have obviously spent a lot of time on the Western powers and focusing on Australia, for example. But just in case anyone thinks otherwise, the USSR was absolutely a critical part of this process. And the World War II was won, and this is another feature that was different between the Western Alliance and the Axis. Germany didn't do partnerships. It didn't do alliances. It didn't have allies as such. Germany and Japan, for example, on paper, they even had a non-aggression pact and a tripartite pact and all the rest of it. But they virtually didn't interact between the two at all. And Japan didn't tell the Germans they were doing Pearl Harbor, for example. That was not a pleasant surprise to them. They virtually didn't cooperate at all. Compare that to England, USSR in America, where, and this was another feature, right, is that this was the most successful alliance in the history of civilization. There's no other way you could put it. As much as they had their differences, those three powers, they cooperated, they collaborated, they came to agreements, they helped each other out in different ways. And I mean, I haven't even touched on the material support that was provided to the USSR. Like, that was fundamental. When it came, so the USSR would have starved if not for Allied food. Just taking one example, right? It's very clear on that. And Khrushchev himself actually acknowledged that after the war, by the way. So anyway, but just to be clear, USSR was a very key component to this. This would not have worked. It would not have been as successful as it was without those three powers and the way they worked together. It drives me mad when one side or the other says, "Oh, we won." No. We all won collectively.
Yeah. Oh,
and then along came the Cold War and all of that.
Well, there's other things around that, and look, I am not in any way going to say that Stalin was a good guy. He just wasn't. This was an alliance of necessity, but putting that aside, the way they worked together was extraordinary. I mean, given the differences, fundamental differences between these major powers, it was extraordinary. And the US, UK alliance in particular, I mean, you find another example anywhere in history of that. It was extraordinary.
Indeed. So much to learn. Thank you. Shall we just see if anyone has any more questions, and then we should probably wrap up soon. All good. Andrew, you were off mute earlier. Does that mean you have a question, or?
Anyway, this was a terrific talk. We've had 2 terrific talks now, and I don't want other people to be intimidated against volunteering to do the third one. But thank you very much, Marcus.
Well,
that was fascinating. I for one learned a lot from.
Yeah, me too.
Well, look, I've only scratched the surface in many ways, in
Absolutely.
a very short period, and there's a lot of research to go yet to work through the detail. But
yeah, yep. We have Darren up next in our series. I'm not sure if we have an exact date and time yet for Darren, but it will be after the trimester finishes, so you can all relax a little, and really looking forward to that one. And I think this is something we can keep going because, people have so much, there's so much that we can learn from our students and their passions, and I'm just loving it so much. And thank you everyone for coming along today, and hopefully we'll be able to have this recording up on YouTube quite soon, and then we'll be you can all share it around, and we'll be emailing the recordings of both of our talks so far in the next mail out that we do, which will go to, well, over 1,000 people, so hopefully
and
some of them will click on it.
They'll go on the Modern Money Lab site as well, won't they?
Yeah,
our website too.
Indeed.
So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity as well. Greatly appreciated.
Thanks, Marcus. Fantastic talk. All right. Well, we'll see you again at some stage. We'll have a social event online towards the end of the term, and then stay tuned for when you can hear what Darren's been working on. Really looking forward to that too.
Not so.
All right. Bye, folks. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.